Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Hong Kong. I welcome you all to the fourth session of the graduate students panel. My name is Mr. Salahuddin. I'm a PhD candidate here at the School of Communication and Films, Hong Kong Baptist University, and I'll be chairing this session. And with me at the panel table is Matea. Yeah, she is also a professor here at the School of Communication and Films, Hong Kong Baptist University. So before I proceed, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this conference for granting us graduate students the opportunity and the platform to present our research. It's very, very commendable. And this part of the conference is for graduate students and by graduate students. And I also want to commend my colleagues here who have been working tirelessly for the past 3 days to ensure that the technical aspect of this conference is well taken care of. Thank you so much, guys. All right, so this session is a continuation of the previous session on soft power, and we have 3 panelists who will be speaking to us from India, Spain, and the Netherlands on very interesting topics. But before I introduce the speakers, I would like to say that this session will be on for an hour and 15 minutes, and this leaves each speaker 15 minutes to give their presentation so that we'll have enough time for questions and answers. So I'll introduce the first speaker now. The first speaker is Isha Jila Iqbal. She completed her BA in English from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, India. And she completed her MA in Comparative Literature from the University of Hyderabad. She's currently a doctoral research scholar in the Department of Cultural Studies at the same university where she had her first degree. And she's working on the 20th century Kerala Cultural Public Sphere. Her areas of interest include cultural history, book history, translation studies, comparative Indian literature, Marxism, and microhistory. So today, Isha will be talking about digitizing nostalgia, translated Soviets in the Kerala Public Sphere. So Isha, would you start with your presentation?
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I would like to share my screen now. Okay. It's morning here, so good morning, everyone. I am Isha. I'm a doctoral scholar from IFLO, Hyderabad. The title of my paper today is Digitizing Nostalgia, Translated Soviet in the Kerala Public Sphere. Let me first begin by how I got into the topic. I was about 9 or 10 years old. I was at my mom's place, snooping around like old bookshelves and cupboards to see what I could find. And I came across a hardbound book, beautiful illustrations, great quality printing. It was a Malayalam translation of the Russian novel Three Fat Men by Yuri Oleshev. Now, I was completely fascinated by it. I open it and see that it was printed and published in the Soviet Union, 1985. And at the end, it read, "Dear reader, if you have any suggestions, write to us." And the address also said Moscow, USSR. Now, this blew my mind. I could not imagine why anybody in Russia would want to publish a book in Malayalam. So this paper is essentially the aftermath of the curiosity of a 9-year-old. So bear with me. Digitizing Nostalgia, Translated Soviet in the Kerala Public Sphere. Every global phenomenon or international pattern of circulation has a very specific local manifestation. There's a locatedness that arises from an interconnection of a chosen geographical space, a historical juncture, and the socio-political undercurrents that mark the age. Same is the case with the phenomenon of the Cold War. In this article, my approach to the Cold War is micro-historical. In that, instead of grand narratives dealing with diplomatic policies and proxy wars, I would focus on how the larger politics and policies of the period manifested in and affected the people of the Indian state of Kerala. Attempting to analyze every domain of influence is near impossible, so this article would predominantly limit itself to the sphere of literature. The first, longer part of my presentation would deal with a short literary historiography of Malayalam to carefully chart out when and how Soviet literature infiltrated the state's literary sphere. The cultural and political ramifications of the same would be discussed. This would be followed by a second shorter part where I would focus on the recent trend of digitizing.
Isha?
Yes?
I'm very sorry to cut you short. The connection is not so great. So if you could speak a little bit slowly so that we could follow, that would be great.
Okay.
Yes.
Is it better now? I will try.
All right.
Okay. The second part of my presentation would focus on the recent trend of digitizing the Soviet era literature on various social media platforms and how they may serve as an evidence of the reconfiguration of the notion of Soviet Union in the Malayali psyche. For the people who are unfamiliar, Kerala is a small state in southern India with a population of about 35 million. The official language is Malayalam. First, there's a cursory look at the literary historiography of Malayalam. I've divided it into 4 phases. Phase 1 is during the 15th and 16th centuries. This is the early stages of the constitution of Malayalam, where it had taken from the traditional Tamil and Sanskrit models, where devotional poetry was the main genre. Phase 2 is during the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the first formal tryst of Malayalam literature with a truly international counterpart. English was modeled as the official language and medium of higher education. It also gained popularity and socio-political currency in Kerala, just like it did in the rest of India. English books began to be translated into Malayalam, and prominent literary figures such as Shakespeare, Milton, Keats, etc. became more familiar in the Malayali reading circles. This was also the time when the previous models of Sanskrit and Tamil were relegated, and models from English literature was adopted, such as the novel. Phase 3 is during the early 20th century, where we see a shift primarily because of the Kerala Renaissance, which was a general democratic trend against caste and royalty and feudalism in Kerala. And this was also reflected in art. This was also the time that the potential of literature as a tool of activism and intervention was recognized and celebrated. In conjunction with Kerala Renaissance ethos, there was also a rising anti-colonial sentiment. And English suddenly began to be perceived not just as a literary language, but also a cultural system, one that is synonymous with a dangerous political history of occupation and collusion. And there also began to emerge in Kerala during this time a heightened receptivity towards alternate foreign models in place of English. This leads us to phase 4, which is the mid-20th century. So in this politically dynamic, very receptive soil comes the Soviet translations of the Cold War period, which is the focus of this paper. The period of Cold War, in political terms, let's begin like that. Globally, the period of Cold War, charted approximately from 1947 to 91, bore witness to a heightening of the previously existing geopolitical and ideological tensions between the Western Bloc led by the United States and the Eastern headed by the Soviet Union. It was cold in that there was no direct military combat, but both the superpowers fought to establish their superiority through proxy wars, military deployment, espionage, nuclear arsenal development, and competitive scientific advancement. The Cold War was as much, if not more, about ideology as it was about power. The two superpowers held fundamentally incompatible conceptions of the organization of political, economic, and social life, capitalism and communism, and the victory in the war meant a global advancement of one of these regime types. This saw both the US and the Soviet Union waging a war of ideological propagation amongst their own allies, in their adversaries' camps, and in the hearts and minds of the larger undecided neutrals. One way this was accomplished was through the production and dissemination of various artistic products, books, documentaries, movies, articles, advertisements, etc. I will be limiting myself to literature here. There have been numerous studies which have analyzed the role of American cultural productions. Not many are available about the Soviet quarters. This is one such attempt. The USSR's calculated employment of literature did not actually commence with the Cold War. In fact, since its inception, the Union has had a successful use of literature in its state-building enterprise. It was a reckoning of language as the strongest political weapon and literature as a propaganda capable of engineering human souls that had made the Communist Party in the USSR establish and develop state-owned publishing giants such as Progress, FLBH, Raduga, and Mir. These publishing houses printed and distributed quality works and translations within and across Russian boundaries for cheap costs. These also included prominent magazines for international readers. Along with the large-scale process of dissemination of literature with Moscow as its epicenter, the Soviet Union also helped set up and then subsidize publishing houses and bookshops across much of what was then known as the Third World. In the milieu of the newly independent nation of India, India gained independence in 1947, which was vexed by an acute shortage of paper, making books an expensive commodity. These publications from the Soviet Union flooded and restyled the literary sphere during the Cold War years. They were published in up to 13 different Indian languages in addition to English to ensure unparalleled quality, readability, and to avoid the pitfalls of an indirect translation via English. The Soviet government even hired an assortment of Indians to live in Moscow, learn Russian, and then directly translate these books into their regional languages. This was also the first time that the Indian readers were introduced to offset printing. In this way, literary productions from the USSR effectively cut across geographic, economic, and linguistic barriers in India, making their presence felt in major cities and small towns alike. One cannot discuss the literature of the erstwhile Soviet Union without highlighting the ideology that was at its crux. USSR's mission of disseminating literature was rooted in the clear propaganda of spreading its ideological cornerstone to the developing nations, while at the same time trying to construct and bolster a favorable, if not perfect, image of itself amongst its readers. This was accomplished by a strict adherence to draconian censorship policies of the Communist Party and a greater state control over the publishing houses in Moscow. The literature that came out of Soviet Union during the Cold War years can be divided into three: Gossestat, Tamistat, and Samizdat. Only Gossestat was the literature that came out from the official publishing houses in the Soviet Union. Considering how the translation and dissemination process was headed by the state-established publishing houses, it does not require much thought to conclude that the literary productions that were in circulation in Kerala was limited to Gossestat. Embodying the spirit of socialism's bigger political struggle, there was an abundance of the political works of Marx, Lenin, and Plekhanov, and classics from the likes of Pushkin, Gorky, and Leskov. These writers, who made explicit their identities as materialist philosophers and whose politics inclined overtly or covertly to socialism. Now, in the context of Kerala, these books were printed and published and disseminated by the Prabhat Book House, which was registered under the Communist Party in Kerala. It functioned as an outlet for making available to the average Malayali reader fine translated specimens of Russian classics, folktales, political works, children's literature, and glossy magazines. Now, the next section is the impact of these Soviet translations on the Malayalam public sphere. At a general level, it can be said that these translations helped advance the young state's literacy mission by providing cheap reading material for the people en masse. The impact of the Russian influence was so strong that a whole generation of parents began naming their kids Stalin and Lenin and Nikita. But if one were to categorically divide the impact, I would say it was primarily in two domains, that of literary and political. In the domain of literary, the first was the replacement of English. The Soviet Union's gradual and successful elimination of English literature as the gold standard for global literary production in the Malayalam literary sphere. English was reduced to a language through which Russian masterpieces could be accessed. In Francesca Orsini's terms, it became a medium rather than the paragon of literariness. There also developed a successful but reductive equation where world literature in Kerala meant translated Soviet books. The other impact in the literary sphere was the adoption of socialist realism as the thematic paradigm. In 1937, following the All-Union Congress of Soviets' adoption of socialist realism as the only tolerable aesthetic style, there were a couple of authors in Kerala who formed the Progressive Literary Association, which also adopted the socialist realism as the thematic paradigm. Any famous books of those times, novels such as Scavenger's Son or From the Gutter, we see farmers and workers, people from the marginalized sections who were not deemed as fit to be protagonists in the books before that, were now the protagonists. Now the domain of the political. This is where Kerala breaks away from the rest of India. Throughout the period of Cold War, despite USSR strategic intervention, India as a nation had largely remained neutral without actually joining the communist bloc. However, the diffusion of the left ideology through the translated literature into Malayali social ethos was so powerful that it actually manifested in the political domain. I believe that the ideology of communism, which argued for equality of all and called for a revolution in which the working class overthrew the bourgeoisie, struck a chord with them, not only because it seemed like an ideal worth working towards, but also because the socio-political situation in Kerala in the 1930s reflected the Russian scenario of the 1880s. There was an uncanny resemblance in terms of the lived experience. The life and subjectivity under a rotting feudalistic structure, which was evoked in the Russian author's works, was not strange to the Malayali reader. Having had to survive under a heavily caste-based feudalistic structure themselves, the working class Malayali readers' lived experience and history had paved way for the work's effortlessly relatability and strong pro-communist sentiment in Kerala. They experienced the Soviet through words and mesmerized by its achievements in science, agriculture, industrial production, sports, and literature, began to look up to Soviet as the perfect utopia for which they needed to strive. Taking inspiration from the Russian model of revolution, the Communist Party of Kerala was formed in 1935, and when the first general election to the State Assembly was held in 1957, the Communist Party won a majority through the ballot for the first time in global history. This stands as a testament to the successful ideological infiltration into the Malayali psyche that the Soviet Union had accomplished through the conduit of literature, the aftermath of which is still evident today. Even now, Kerala is the only state in India which has a communist government at its head. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Soviet translations had dominated the Malayalam literary sphere for most part of the 20th century. The lowering of the hammer and sickle over the Kremlin for the final time in December 25, 1991, had sealed to the world the downfall of the strongest and most influential communist federation till date. But for the reading public of Kerala, the dissolution of the USSR also meant the end of the golden era of Soviet literature. The Soviet Union's self-approved taintless image, which was propagated, had remained almost intact until its collapse in 1991. After this, the Samizdat and Tamizdat writings from the likes of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, describing its internal conflicts, poverty, gross violation of human rights, and its colonial brutality in Chechnya, came to see the light of the world. At once, literature from the Soviet Union stopped, and along with it was lost the Union's place in the Malayali psyche as the embodiment of perfection. Now I come to the second section, which is nostalgia and digitization. From 1991, for about 20 years, these books from the Soviet Union had mostly remained within personal collections, libraries, or small reading groups. Since the second decade of the 21st century, there has been an off. Yes?
Your presentation, you're running out of time.
Oh, okay.
You have 2 minutes left.
There has been an offbeat trend of digitizing them on social media platforms such as Google Groups and Facebook Groups. How is this digitization trend different from the Soviet literature of the previous era? I would say that the main difference is a categorical delinking with ideology. People who are contributors to this digitization platforms do not push for the ideology of Marxism or communism in any way. Rather, they have reduced it to innocent childhood memorabilia. Here, the Soviet literature has reached a cult status in India. It has been elevated to the category of classics. There's a certain indisputability, a universal acceptance of their quality and stature. They stand above all temporal competition. The creators and contributors of these digitized platforms believe that they will be able to carry forward the legacy of the erstwhile Soviet literature, excluding its ideological angle and focusing instead on its irrefutable classical status, into a generation which increasingly prefers an electronic version over a hard copy. Thank you. I think that's all.
Thank you very much, Isha, for that wonderful presentation. So without wasting much time, we move over to our second presenters. There are two actually. Shenglan, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, please forgive me. Shenglan Chin and Zi Shengyang. Both of them are PhD candidates at the Department of Audiovisual Communication and Advertising, Autonomous University of Barcelona. For Shenglan, our research interests span globalization, cultural studies, to comparative studies and computational methods. Shenglan holds a master's in audiovisual communication at the same university. Our bachelor's degree is in Spanish from Central South University in Hunan, China. And she is, as the first author, she has published research in a multilingual academic journal called the Observatorio, and has presented her research in international conferences like the IMCR and the ICA. For Xi Zheng, he earned his master's degree in mass communication at the Kim Wee School of Communication and Information at Singapore Nanyang Technological University in 2017. And his research interests include social media, digital platforms, and race, ethnicity, and sports. So today, both of them will be presenting the topic, Imagined Enemy or the Hope of the Village, Post-Colonial Discourse in Media Representation of Wu Lei in China and Spain. So I suppose Shenglan would be presenting, right? Okay, so you may begin. If you could unmute yourself. Right.
So can you see the presentation now?
Yes, yes, we can.
And you can hear me right? Good.
Yes.
Okay, let me start. Hi, good morning. So here is like 6:30 here in Barcelona, and my name is Shenlan Qing, and I'm PhD candidate in Autonomous University of Barcelona, and my cousin Kaishon Yao, who is also in the panel. And I'm going to present you our study about post-colonial discourse in media representation of Wu Lei in China and Spain. And firstly, let me tell you about the background of this study. Wu Lei is currently the only Chinese footballer in the top 5 European football leagues and one of the best players in the Chinese football system. He participated in Espanyol football class in 2019. China national men's football team has shown sluggish performance in the long term. The improvement of national football has been enrolled in political projects in Xi Jinping's presidency. Chinese private capital has been the biggest spender on European football clubs. Chinese firm Rostar Group holds almost 100% shares in Espanyol football clubs since 2016. And the theoretic framework of this study is we use post-colonial theories. Post-colonialism provides a critical perspective to the progressive narrative that the modernized West civilization will finally overtake the classical and ancient civilization. And it also explains the cultural and social practices that emerge after colonization. It is an umbrella term under which nationality, identity, Orientalism, and modernization are frequently discussed. Football is a worldwide unevenly developed game. The global football can be seen as a symbolic forum in which the third world resists the domination and the hegemony from the first world. However, there is a limitation when we use post-colonial theory to understand global sport issues, is that the post-colonialism always falls into the binary of the third world to the first world, or the binary of the colonizer and the colonized. So this study intends to make contribution to two general questions. If colonialism can be widely applied to understand international sport issues beyond the binary of the colonizer and the colonized, or the first world and the third world. How does the post-colonial memory continue in local and international practice through sport affairs nowadays? So specifically, this study aims to analyze post-colonial discourse in media coverage about Wu Lei in China and in Spain. In this comparative study, China and Spain are not precisely maintain the colonized and the colonizer relation, or the first and the third world relation. So we use critical discourse analyze method to our study. We collected 872 reports from China and Spain, both generalist interest, specialist interest, political directed, commercial directed, left, center left political opinion and center right political opinion in China and Spain have been considered in our research. So firstly, let me introduce you very briefly our main finding. In this study, we just very obviously find that in China, the most obvious discourse is nationalist discourse, and in Spain, is Orientalist discourse. And I will explain that later. And another finding is that this study provides a perspective to understand international sport issues in which the discourses not only maintain post-colonial memories of racist modernity Orientalism, but also the discourse are continuously constructed by the flow of international power relations through the interacting among colonial memories, national political forces, neoliberalism, and global capital flow in sport industry. We find Chinese media constructs Wu Lei's athletic identity as a masculine hero, emphasizing his masculinity, which is internalized through post-colonial discourse. And Spanish media pays more attention to his mental superiority, which also reproduces the Asian and Asian player stereotypes in Western media. And his physicality is generally underrepresented in both Chinese and Spanish media, which also another time reproduce the stereotype of an Asian player. And both Chinese and Spanish reports put Wu Lei's nationality together with the symbolic elements of Spanish football clubs. It reflects the image of Chinese football as marginalized in Western and Spanish football system. Wu Lei bears the national aspiration in participating in Western football system and resisting the colonizers in this symbolic forum. Like we can see in these sentences, like Wu Lei is the first Chinese football player who stepped in the Bernabeu Stadium, and he is the first Chinese who scored in La Liga, and the first Chinese to play against Barca in Camp Nou. While Chinese media and fans took the match between Barcelona and Espanyol football clubs as a battle between Wu Lei and Messi, Spanish media emphasizing the coach of emphasizing what the coach of the Espanyol said. The coach Rubi, who respond to this kind of comparison between Messi and Wu Lei. He says, we will see Wu Lei achieve the level of Messi, but we won't fool ourselves. He is not our Messi. He helps a lot and he can train very well, but it's not an equal comparison. This phrase actually they recognize Wu Lei's professional ability. However, they also manifested that professionality in Spanish football system is unchallengeable. And Chinese media also recognize such inferiority in football professionality. In this slide, we can read a sentence from China Sport Daily, who actually made a hierarchy of athletic levels of footballers from different racial and national backgrounds, from the Iberian American footballers, Messi and Ronaldo, and the South Korean players, and to the most low-level player, which is a Chinese player. And Chinese media use two colloquial expressions, which refers to Wu Lei's participation in Espanyol, the hope of the village and studying abroad. The hope of the whole village, which refers the only extraordinary person lives from his home village to a university or a big city. And studying abroad, in Chinese, it means liu yang. Liu means live, yang means foreign, and also refers to modern in Chinese. This word is opposite to tu in Chinese, which means local. And this narrative is generated from the daily discourse in the unbalanced development between rural and urban areas in the process of modernization in China. The inferiority of football professionality actually refreshed the colonial memory of the underdeveloped China among Chinese media and Chinese football fans. And the contestation of ideology occurs between political driven courage and commercial driven courage. In Chinese political narrative like People Daily, the action of studying abroad should contribute to the national football project, while the value of self-realization is revealed in the Chinese commercial driven narrative like Titan. Orientalism has been reproduced in Spain through the representation of Wu Lei and China. Spanish media use expressions like Asian giant, Asian giant, and a real stranger to refer to China and Wu Lei. Spanish media also take government intervention to spot as political otherness. However, they focus more on the power of Chinese private capital, contestation of ideology between central-left and central-right media occurs through the convergence, which nuancedly evaluate the weight among Wulei's athletic ability. Chinese private capital represented by Chen Yansheng, as well as Espanyol football clubs in related issues. And the power of private capital is underestimated in Chinese coverage. In an interview of Titan with Chen Yansheng, the Chinese president of Espanyol, Chen just took nationalism as the most important value and commercial value as underestimated through Chen's word when it contested with athletic professionality. As we can see here, Chen says, I have had the desire to introduce Chinese players to La Liga. However, he also emphasized that we don't introduce players for attention or any commercial purpose. In China, on the one hand, the inferiority in football professionality, consciously or unconsciously, incites the colonized memory of the underdeveloped China, which reinforced nationalism among Chinese media and fans. On the other hand, nationalism also emphasized by national projects in football development, as well as media coverage. Not only the nationalism has been directed, manifested by journalist practice, but also the athletic inferiority and the underdeveloped memory has been reinforced when journalists taking Western media as an important qualification to Wulei. And Chinese companies and Chinese private capital have penetrated into Spanish and European market in recent years. Spanish football clubs also needs to seek global interest and investments in the last decades. Interacting with such ongoing global capital flow in the football industry, the discourse of an economic hegemon has emerged, which reproduces the ministerialism and xenophobia to the Far East country, whose economic and political system is different from the Western system. In the process of reproducing Orientalist discourse, contestation of ideology occurs between the center-left and center-right media, which represents the political power within Spain. No matter nationalist discourse in China or Orientalist discourse in Spain, both of them actually reinforce national and racial identity by distinguishing self and others. Through such distinction, political power of governance have been legitimized within each country. This study provides a perspective to understand international sport issues in which the discourses not only maintains post-colonial memory of racist modernity Orientalism, but also the discourses are continuously constructed by the interflow of international power relations through the interaction among colonial memory, national political forces, neoliberalism, and global capital flow in sport industry. So that's all of my presentation. And if you are interested in our topic and if you can make friends with us, you can follow us on WeChat or on Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a very wonderful presentation. All right, just a quick reminder, if you have questions, please do well to drop it in the Q&A section. All right, our last presenter for today is Kaishon Yao. She is a recent research master's graduate of comparative literary studies at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Our current research focuses on reading screen dance in socialist and post-socialist China through critical affect theory. Her broader research interest includes Cold War narratives and visuality, representation of time and historicity, and theories of the body. So today she will be talking to us about visions of spatial temporality after the grand narrative, nostalgia and screen dance in Youth 2017, and The Shape of Water 2017. You may begin your presentation now.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Great. So I'm really glad that I'm the third one to present, because I think the previous two presentations has made it pretty clear that we live in a discursive space, whether it be in the theater of football or book publishing or digitizing, which makes it easy for me to simply enter into the key running idea that supports and structures my influences, my entire research. And the running idea behind this paper is Slavoj Žižek's project, which alerts us to the non-equation of the end of the Cold War with the end of ideology. So for Žižek, ideology is defined as the production of surplus enjoyment that sustains the symbolic relation of the subject to the world. In simpler terms, ideology is what produces the subject, and ideological contents are those that psycho-effectively makes a subject's sense of self cohere with its sense of the world. And this is related to the central topic of my paper, which is the representation of visions of spatial temporality after the Cold War. We need to look at imaginaries of spatial temporalities because the activity of geopolitical ideological production implies spatial temporal reconfigurations. Evoking the Cold War narrative suggests not a mapping or zoning of polities along the lines of political alliances or social ideological divide, but treats geopolitical configuration as ideologically produced. And in this light, reimagines the contemporary global political topography as one in which the divide is subject to contingent updates, and where the social political proximity, indifference, affinity, or animosity amongst nation states fluctuates as a result of ideological productions. In this sense, we may regard individual subjects as consumers of the theater of geopolitics, which includes football and includes book publishing and redigital. Yes, we may regard the individual subjects as consumers of theater of geopolitics, of which the mise en scène, meaning the arrangement of scenery, is spatial temporally produced by ideology. Oh, wait, I need to go to the next one. Right. It bears noting that evoking the Cold War narrative is by itself an act of ideological production that historicizes the subject. Calling the present world order as Cold War inevitably recalls it and casts the present temporality as post-Cold War. And this sticky recalcitrance of time points to the temporal dimension of our collective aphasia, the proliferation of the prefix post, neo, late, new, when it comes to giving our current era a name. It also indicates postness or post-postness as discursive slippery slope that could be pressed into service of ideological production and history writing. In fact, a range of work from post-socialist studies have noted how the post in post-socialism has gone from descriptive to performative, utilized as a temporal container to justify economic rationalization and neo-colonial actions. And we can discuss this point in detail later in our discussion. Now, suffice to say that postness itself is a powerful discursive tool that produces our experience of space and time and interpolates us as ideological subjects through its spatial temporal reconfiguration. Given the issues and contentions outlined above, I think the two selected films give us some clues with their cinematic expressions as to how postness is structured and where does its ideological appeal or discursive power come from. The two selected films are Youth by director Feng Xiaogang, in Chinese it's called Fanghua, and The Shape of Water by Guillermo del Toro. Both films are cinematic instances that evoke Cold War imaginaries to bring into relief the post-Cold War present. And both films share the theme of dance. Youth recollects life in a Chinese provincial military song and dance ensemble in the 70s, while The Shape of Water features the emotional involvement of a Cold War era love story through dance. And both films are nostalgic films, both endorsing a lavish cinematic aesthetic of postness. And their nostalgic aesthetics are constructed not only by technologically enhanced color saturation or sentimental music scores, but also by borrowing the visual tropes and narrative genres that belong to the Cold War era. Those tropes and narrative genres elicit cultural historical associations of desire and displeasure, the underlying spatial temporal configuration of which is cathectically reworked by the film's dance scenes. In other words, screen dance in these films bring into light the desire and displeasure of both the portrait and the viewing subject as that of a historical creature situated in specific spatial temporal coordination. Crucial to my analysis, the film's seamless passing into and out of a fictive temporality as opposed to the real by way of spatial arrangement. Through this passing, The films establish the discursive structure of postness is an assignment of the past to one temporality and the present to another. Later in my conclusion, I will propose to inject the fictive temporality into our considerations of the spatial temporal traductions of contemporary theater of geopolitics. And I'll ask what kind of fictive temporalities are utilized in, for example, Twitter diplomacy, for example, football theater, and for example, the digitalization of old Soviet books. But given time, I actually only have time to talk a little bit about youth. I already fear that I can't finish everything. So youth follows a cohort of young soldiers at a provincial military's art troupe. In particular, the protagonists He Xiaoping and Liu Feng. They spent some idle years within the high walls of the art trope's residency, comparatively undisturbed by the fervid events of cultural revolution, but only to be disillusioned by the betrayal of their community that once promised a socialist utopia. Both Liu Feng and Xiaoping were later expelled and sent to the battlefront of Sino-Vietnamese War. Meanwhile, economic reform marched on in China, drastically changing the society. The film borrows heavily from the narrative genre of Chinese revolutionary cinema, in particular its double discourse of history and individual, by juxtaposing the coming-of-age story with the violent introduction of historical events such as Sino-Vietnamese War and China's reform and opening up. By the end of the film, the protagonists have learned to come to terms with the general historical reorientation by situating themselves in the new spatial temporal coordinates. Due to time limit, I will delineate the narrative arc as well as the changing quality of spatial temporalities of this film by showing you three key moments. The first features a spectacle of gathering at the beginning of the film as Liu Feng and Xiaoping entered the art trope's rehearsal hall. And I'll just play this thing very quickly. Community was therefore an aesthetic bonding, and in youth, that film, the camera work gives form to such aesthetic bonding. As it wanders around the hall, zooming on the musicians whose instrument played the dominant melody, then turning to the direction the performer was looking at as the musical phrase progressed into another. There emerges a naturalized synchronicity between the pace of the music and the rhythm of sighting, between the musical variation and members interpersonal relations. And the kind of utopian communal experience is reminiscent of Hegel's description of the Geist, the spirit, which describes the desiring being's movement to establish an identity coextensive with the world, realized through the mutual recognition of the form each gives to the world. The subject experiences metaphysical pleasure in its self-sameness with the spirit, through rediscovering the spirit as the substance of its interdependence with others. In simpler terms, I want to bring to your attention how the space in this film, in this scene, is endowed with a sense of coextensiveness with others, with the world, and how the experience of time here feels eternal. The film, however, reconstructs this ideal communal world in the socialist era only to tear it apart. Just like Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is a fictive experience created by and through his text, which delineates in terms of its own temporality, the structures that condition and informs historical experiences as we know it. Similarly, the film brutally ironizes the fictiveness of its constructed experience by reusing the same panning and wandering mode of cinematographic address in the later battle scene. And I'll play this thing also very. This is pretty violent. I'm sorry, guys. Like, just I should have warned you sooner. All right. So in this scene, the camera repeats its previous panning and wandering, but the crisscrossing of sighting, which directed the movement of the camera in the rehearsal scene, is replaced by the chaotic tracks of startled horses and flying bullets, the skillful musical bodies of the performers by the wounded, screaming bodies of the soldiers. The camera panning around in this actually 6-minute continuous shot is searching for a sense of community, or a sense in war as a communal action, or a sense of war as communal action, by trying to establish some sort of rhythm amidst the bombing, shooting, and shouting, but to no avail. Faced with the authority of war, the self-assurance of any ontological harmony as spirit fractures into senselessness. The fictive temporality faces harsh reality and demands reconciliation. And this leads to the last thing that I want to share with you. A quick summary of the story. So He Xiaoping, which is girl that's sitting in the middle, He Xiaoping became a nurse at the battlefront, and she lost her mind after the war. The film contributes an especially moving dance scene when the art troupe performed for the patients at the mental hospital, only to find that Xiaoping was sitting among them, unable to recognize the fellows from her past. Racial threshold, she's also releasing herself from the collective hold and become an individual. And given that there's a temporal sense that's been previously portrayed in that collective communal existence, she has, so by transgressing the spatial threshold, she has also emerged into a new era, emerged into a new history. History moves again as she steps out of the door. But I think very importantly is that this new history being presented here, it's not endowed with newness, but actually with postness, with a sense of somatic coming to term with. Yes, and in this sense, although the film cements the present era as post-socialist, as a radical break from the socialist past, it reaches a kind of reconciliation emotionally felt in the scene of farewell, this dancing scene of farewell to the past, but no new cinematic thesis of individual collective relation has been proposed. And this is actually a very resounding problem within Chinese cinema now, that literally there has been no cinematic thesis of a new relationship between the individual and the collective in our new historical existence. So to round things up, returning to the theme of the conference, which is Cold War narratives, to the extent that Chinese social media has been stirring anti-Americanism, not in a truly critical philosophical sense of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and anti-imperialism, but a blinded bigotry that disguises its own hegemonic interest of global self-assertion, we may say that China is rebuilding a nationalist collective identity that takes up the void after the post-socialist breakdown of communal coexistence. This is not a new argument, but one that deserves reinvestigation since China's recent actions regarding Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang, as well as the spatial temporal technologies such as zoning and camping involved in these actions, is concerningly part of the narrative of the new Cold War that talks about China's rationalizing sphere of influence on the rise. So my analysis demonstrates how cinema utilizes an emotionally charged crossing of a temporal threshold to ward against issues from the past that still constitutes the present. I invite you to take up seriously the way the film deliver postness through their context-based use of the fictive temporality, especially when it comes to the increasing invocation of a new Cold War in our present geopolitical historical time. And this evocation unavoidably elicits the present as the post. So we may ask, what kind of fictive temporality is constructed when the new Cold War is simultaneously post-Cold War? And what kind of historical subject does it produce? How does the fictive temporality interpolate the subject as historical? Yes, to ask this question is to inject the fictive temporality into the spatial temporal productions of contemporary theater of geopolitics. Given that this theater is heavily mediated by social medias, as exemplified in practices such as Twitter diplomacy, we may ask a few more related questions. In what way does the social media curate a fictive temporality differently from cinema? What role does the online subject play now that they are not merely consumer of cinematic texts, but active participants of virtual discussions too? The picture for critical analysis is exponentially complicated and far exceeds what one disciplinary paper could do, and therefore calls for more academic work in this direction. And that is all of my presentation. Thank you, guys. I hope I have not exceeded too much of time. All right, thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that very detailed presentation. All right, so these three papers present very interesting perspectives on the role that different art forms like literature, films, cinema, and even sports play in propagating the soft power ideologies and agenda of the Soviet Union, China, and the United States during and after the Cold War. So I'm going to open the floor now for questions and answers. We have question and answers. You could just...
If not, can I?
Okay, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. And I think they flow very nicely or follow very nicely our first panel on soft power. What connects these three presentations is the consideration of aesthetics in nation building, and nation building is a process which is a sort of self-contradictory process of building one's own identity, but always relational. It's always in relation to another or to the other, as the second presentation has shown. And my question would be, in this building of the aesthetics through literature or football, sports, or film, where especially in the second and third talk, the body and the politics of the body is really prominent. But in this building of the aesthetics, for the sake of politics, or building and constructing politics or national mythology through aesthetics, imagination seems to play a great part. Imagination of what one is as a nation and a collective, and what one wants to become. And at the same time, I'm wondering about this nationalist or nationalism as a mythology, on the one hand being fixed and static, on the other hand being transformative in the way that is it updated through new bodies, through new kinds of bodies, through new kinds of imaginations. So my question would be, if you could reflect a little bit to all the speakers, a little bit more on this dynamic between this fixed and fixated nationalism as a mythology. Mythology is something unchanging, right? It is passed on from one generation to another. But then there is this changing aesthetics and different forms of politicizing the art. And what is there, the dynamic between being fixed, being firmly ingrained, and at the same time being transformative? If you could reflect on that through your works, through your studies of particular these arts and sports and films.
Right. Isha, would you like to respond to that first?
Okay, sure. So I really appreciate the question, the aesthetics in the context of nation building and how it changes. In the larger context of India, we see a period when Britain was seen as the model that needed to be emulated. That was during the colonial period, the heyday of colonialism. And then it comes to a point where there's an anti-colonial sentiment rising across the nation, which is the point where the nation building, as you mentioned, came into play. And this nation building obviously was based on a mythology. In the Indian context, it was the Hindu mythology, which sort of categorized people into caste and hierarchies and just blending. It was basically on the epics and the myths that this idea was from. We had a great history before the British came in. So let's go back to that to check these people out. That was the format. In the context of Kerala, however, this did not last for very long. And I think it is because of the Renaissance that I mentioned, because the national myth that the larger India followed was very narrow in that it limited itself to a certain religion and even certain castes of the religion. So then Kerala was sort of looking for other options to put itself together against the British, but let's not go with the nation one. We need something else. So there was a more regional one, but at the same time, global one. And that's where something like socialism from Russia came in. They're like, this can be adopted. This can be used as an ideal to, bring the whole of the society together. And at the same time, work against the British, because we have another model now. We don't need the British model anymore. So nationalism in the context of Kerala, at one level was national, but it did not remain like that for long. It is an underlying current, yes, but predominantly it also went to other global ideals like the Soviet Union's, which was implemented and adopted. And I think transformation is a part of it as well, because later on, after the dissolution of the USSR, we also see that Kerala is like, no, let's not go with that now. We need something else. So now it's sort of looking forward to there is a kind of reminiscing of the Soviets' great era and slight communism ideals that come into cultural productions even now, but it's not celebrated as such. Even though we have a communist government now, it is looking for other options, sort of mixing certain capitalist mentalities in the policies as well. So I think it's keeping on changing. I hope it answered.
Thank you so much. That was a very wonderful response. Shanglan, would you like to have a go at the question?
Okay, I'd like to point this question out in 3 points. First is neoliberalism, the interaction of neoliberalism and nationalism in China. Second is the colonial memory of the underdeveloped China, and the third is Orientalism in Spain. And firstly, as in my generation, we are very educated in both ideologies like nationalism and neoliberalism. And as I presented on my presentation, there is one slide is in People Daily. They just they say that Wu Lei should make contribution to the national project after he's studying abroad. And then in the commercial reports, they just say that Wu Lei wants to improve himself for as the action of serving in the Espanyol football club. So that's how actually these two ideology, I said contest. However, it also interact to each other. I think all of our my generation who are educated in China as our primary education, we were educated as your personal dream, your personal career should devote to the national project, to the national dream of China. So that's how I think the value of self-realization or in the neoliberalism interact and support nationalism in China. And another thing I would like to talk is the colonial memory of the underdeveloped China. And even though many countries in the world think that China is a hegemony nowadays, China is very powerful nowadays. However, there is considerable part in China which is underdeveloped nowadays. There are rural places, there are underdeveloped city. And on the second hand, I think the colonial memory, I think the memory of the Second World, memory of the communist China is very radical in the imagination of Chinese. Like the young generation has never lived in that kind of era. However, this kind of collective memory is very radical, I think, in our kind of imagination and memory. And another thing is Orientalism in Spain. As we started this study by exploring nationalism in China. However, if we want to compare China and Spain, we can't use the scheme of nationalism in Spain, because I think nowadays in European country, nationalism is just like a political taboo or cultural taboo here to talk about we are so nationalist, we are proud of our nation. It just seems like a political correctness to be open to all of the world. However, at the same time, the Orientalism is also reproduced through media, through movies, through daily discourse in European civilization. And it is same as nationalism, which distinguish self and others, and also construct their own national identity in European countries. That's right. My point.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have some questions here. The first one is from Vinit Agrawal, and it goes to Kaishon and Isha. So he says, how do you see translation processes being affected through this? Postness or the translation between politics and aesthetics? Is this translation zone a stable one? And how do we see translation changing? So Kaishon, could you go first? Maybe unmute yourself, we can't hear you.
All right, so I think I have to reread the question to understand what exactly is it asking for.
Okay, so the question, do you need me to reread the question?
Closeness of translation between politics and aesthetics. Is this translation zone a stable one? How do we see translation changing? I would like to know what exactly meant by translation here. Does it mean like transcultural exchange, like these films being, or cultural texts, or, you know, in Aisha's case, books being circulated abroad, or so I'm not entirely sure of the question, but Aisha, do you have any?
Okay, maybe Isha should go first.
Okay. I think in my context, translation would just mean a translation from a Russian book into Malayalam. I'm just taking it in the literal sense. As far as politics and aesthetics is concerned, I think it is not stable in that it has changed. In the context of India, because until actually the dissolution of the USSR, India's policies of incurring books from elsewhere has been pretty strict. So we did not have a lot of translations from other parts, and the Soviet governmental intervention to make sure that it reaches parts of India was very rampant, and it's part of the political agenda, and there was a very strong relation between politics and aesthetics in translation. Whereas after India's liberalization policies in the 19th, we see that India was suddenly exposed to global literature from all parts of the world. And there, it was not actually taking translation, especially in the context of Kerala, it was not so much about politics anymore. It was just, it could be just languages that they were not exposed to before, just canonical literature as such from different parts. It was that aesthetics implying politics was no longer the underlying parameter for translations in Kerala anymore. So I think it has changed, and it is changing more now as more literatures are being exposed.
Right, thank you so much. Kaishon, do you want to have another go?
Yes,
okay,
I think I sort of understood what the question is. So is postness, because postness is actually a period of transition, right? So the question is asking whether postness as a period of transitioning is something that is, there is something that guarantees a certain sense of stability or not. I would say that actually in my presentation, I mentioned that postness as a term, especially in post-socialist studies, has been gone from descriptive use to a performative use. So scholars have noted they originally started to describe, the former socialist societies now after the Cold War as post-socialist, because they see it as an accurate description of the socio-political economic situation in post-socialist states. But very recently, but recently, gradually, scholars have noted that the post in post-socialism has been used by powers actually to for their own interests, such as let's say the Western media tend to pin some, let's say, Central Eastern European countries as post-socialist. So kind of in their imaginaries, these countries are kind of stuck in their nostalgic loop forever. So in that sense, they kind of just willfully ignoring the knowledge production in the area of Central Eastern Europe by categorizing them, labeling them as post-socialist, because post in itself always solicits the sense of nostalgia, of not moving forward. So that's one way. And then in the Chinese case, for instance, there's so many things to talk about in the Chinese case. I'll talk about two. So China has been using post as a signifier for as a way to bypass reflections on the destruction that the neoliberal capitalist practices it's been doing since reform and opening up. So they're kind of saying, so it's kind of like a rhetorical thing that we're not socialist nations anymore. We're a post-socialist. Therefore, let's develop this, develop that. But they wouldn't necessarily call, but they are kind of avoiding, the discussion of, look at how look at what the economic rationalization has done to people. that are living increasingly precariously in certain regions.
Right.
And so that's the thing. And then there's another thing. It's this whole, actually, it's very related to Xinlan's discussion, this discourse of like post-colonialism, because a lot of Chinese New Left think of like, still call China as like post-colonial, as something, it's kind of like a temporal container that aligns with the postness of post-socialist. Well, in fact, China could be called, I think, post-colonial, just looking at how, like what it's doing with this, like, you know, what is it called, Belt and Road Initiative, and this whole, like in the South China Sea, this whole expensive enterprise that is currently in the scene. So
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you very much. That was a very beautiful response. We have very few minutes left, and we have two questions from Samir. The first is to Isha as well. He says, in regards to the Soviet literature in India, I understand that the politics left a mark on society, but are the Soviet narratives still at the forefront of cultural consciousness today? Have the people of Kerala written their own socialist literature, even as the state is moving to blend socialism and capitalism? So Isha, could you please quickly respond to that?
Yes, very short answer. Are the Soviet narratives still at the forefront of cultural consciousness today? No, they're not, which is why they're niche now. They're in the digital archive somewhere. They're not in the mainstream format in any form. Have the people of Kerala written their own socialist literature? In the past, yes. In the period that I discussed, in the 20th century, during the Cold War period, yes. Not so much anymore. They don't focus on socialism as a primary concern. Now it's more of gender equality, and it's secularism. They've moved on to different other ideas.
All right.
Very shortly.
Yeah, that was very short. Thank you so much. All right. Samir also asked this question to Shenglan. He says, you mentioned something interesting about how Chinese people are taught in a way that their passion career should serve the national interest. Do you see this behavior or mindset in Wule?
Maybe I like to invite my co-author Zhe to answer this question. He's more specialist to football and footballist.
Okay.
Okay, yes, I can. Let me give an example. We all know Ule is play for Spanish football club, and also he is a member of Chinese football team, a Chinese national football team. So in the day before today, Chinese football team have had a game in Asia. So Ule had to take a long flight from Spanish back to Asia to play for Chinese national football game, and giving up some club games means pay cut. So he devoted himself to Chinese national game, to Chinese national football game.
All right. Thank you so much. Please give us time for one last question from anonymous attendee to Kaishon. He says, for Zizek, cinema is the ultimate pervert art. It doesn't give you what you desire, it tells you how to desire. So do you think nostalgia is what Chinese ought to desire at this temporal juncture, and therefore the youth doles it out?
Wow, I love whoever is asking this question. I love you for asking, because nostalgia is definitely not what we're out to desire. And I do think that the Chinese cinema, not just this film, but many film has been kind of perpetrating the sense of nostalgia as the kind of desire that we should have. And like, remember that the film that I presented is literally, it's a coming of age story, right? Like, they're in this communal living, and then suddenly there's war, and then she has to kind of figure her things out, and like the two protagonists have to figure their own like means of living out in the new post-socialist economic space in China. Like, that narrative arc has been repeatedly replayed in so many films, and I think the Chinese panelists here could affirm this. In we have this genre called the youth genre, like 青春电影 youth film, and it's set in contemporary times. It's about, you know, student life, high school students, and then living in high school, like together, this communal gathering space, and then they have to kind of step out of their high school, this protected shell into the new world, like into the world of adulthood, and have to support their own living, be an aspirational capitalist individual, etc. So this kind of and then that the affect in those like youth genre, like youth film genre, is it's exactly the same as in youth, like this particular film that I'm presenting. Yeah, no wonder it's called youth in English.
Right.
So definitely, I think this is what the cinema is the perfect art. Gives you what we desire, or like tells you that this is how not gives you, tells us how we should desire. And but I also think cinema, if we really pay attention to the detailed way how the cinematography worked, there will be new way that emerges. There will be new cinematic thesis that tells us, okay, that gives a new thesis about the relationship of individual and collective in Chinese society. Actually, there are a lot of attempts in independent cinema. It's kind of stalling, but it's going somewhere.
Right. Thank you so much. I think this brings us to the end of the session. I appreciate every one of you panelists. You gave a very beautiful, presentations. I would like you to join us for the next session, which will start in 10 minutes, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It was nice to hear your presentations. Thank you.